Welcome back, everybody. So today we're changing the page and we're going to be moving into the Hellenistic Age. And particularly, we're going to be covering Alexander the Great. Our focus question is going to be, what were the main issues of contention between Alexander and his Macedonian and Greek followers? Well, when we last left off, we had talked about the military invasion of Persia planned by Philip of Macedon. And things were going swimmingly. The troops were in place. Things were ready to go. But unfortunately for Philip, he got stabbed in 336 by one of his own bodyguards. Suspicious circumstances, to say the least. Historians are still divided on what the issue was. We know it was his bodyguard that did it. Whether Philip just annoyed the guy or someone else was behind it is still hotly debated, but something we don't need to get into here. Well, fortunately for Philip, or for the Macedonians, I guess we should say, Philip had a successor, a young son by the name of Alexander. Now, Alexander was 20 at the time of his father's death. And Alexander quickly moved to consolidate power, put the smackdown on the Greeks, who were already thinking about possibly revolting, and he was successful in doing that. Now, Alexander had been raised a prince, and so he had access to some of the best education of his day. For example, he had access to some of the best Greek tutors, since his father was the king. Most famously, probably Aristotle. Yeah, that Aristotle was his personal tutor. Now, before you guys get jealous and say, why does Alexander get the smartest guy in the world? Don't feel bad. You've got the second best teacher in the world. Now, Alexander's other tutors, were also able to build a love of Greek literature for him, particularly regarding the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer's two great works. And Alexander, in fact, could trace his lineage back to some of these great heroes. For instance, on his dad's side, he claimed descent from Hercules, and on his mom's side, he claimed descent from Achilles. And of course, aside from regular literary education, Alexander would have been trained by his father in the arts of war. As a matter of fact, I obliquely referenced Alexander in the lecture on the Battle of Chaeronea. I said Philip and his young son, whom I don't think I mentioned, was Alexander. So he was well trained already at this time. After consolidating power, in 334, at the age of 22, Alexander the Great set out with 37,000 men on a mission to conquer the world. You'd have to be 22 to think you could do that. His first move was in Asia Minor, and you can see here, this is Asia Minor. And he was immediately met by some of the Persian officials, the satraps, the governors of Asia Minor, and Alexander was able to defeat them. And in doing so, he was able to liberate the Greeks of Asia Minor. You may recall they had been sold out by the Spartans. His next move was to move into modern-day Syria. And here he fought his first major battle, the Battle of Issus. Darius had mobilized the Persian army and had come out to meet Alexander. Alexander found himself outnumbered, But in 333 BC, at the Battle of Issus, Alexander was able to defeat Darius, the king of the Persians, and destroy his army, although he didn't capture Darius himself. Well, with the defeat of Darius at the Battle of Issus, the way was open to Egypt. Most of the cities of the Levant surrendered. I say most. I'm looking at you, Tyre, and I'm looking at you, Gaza. But most of these cities surrendered. And Alexander was able to enter into Egypt unopposed. As a matter of fact, the Egyptians themselves liberated him as honored him as a liberator. They had grown unhappy under Persian rule. And for his part, Alexander did his best to placate the Egyptians, honoring their gods, and so on and so forth. Well, while there, Alexander went on a sightseeing mission of sorts to the oasis at Siwa, here on the map. And he went there because there was a famous oracle there, the oracle to Zeus Ammon. Now, you may remember an oracle is someone who speaks on behalf of the gods, and this god was a combination of the Egyptian god Ammon, the sky god, and the Greeks god Zeus, who was also a sky god, something we'll talk about in a future lecture. This was common in the ancient world. Well, while there, Alexander learned a very interesting piece of information. The oracle informed Alexander that Philip wasn't his real father, but that Zeus was, making him the son of God. And by all indications, Alexander took this to heart, that he was a demigod of sorts. Well, before leaving Egypt, Alexander laid the foundations for what was to be one of the ancient world's greatest cities, the city of Alexander, modestly named after himself. This was going to be a city that really embodied the Hellenistic age. And because it was going to straddle both the Greek world of the Mediterranean and the Egyptian world of the Nile. It's where the confluence of these two bodies of water met. Well, unfortunately for Alexander, he couldn't sit around to enjoy his new conquests. He had bigger fish to fry, namely destroying the Persian Empire. And so he left Egypt and moved up the Euphrates and then to the Tigris River, where once again Darius was waiting with a brand new army. And though outnumbered significantly, Alexander was able to defeat Darius again for the second time. Once again, though, Alexander did not capture Darius, but the way was now open to the Persian heartland. The next stop on the Alexander Express was Babylon, where, similarly, like in Egypt, he was hailed as a liberator and as a demigod by the Babylonians. And like in Egypt, Alexander was careful to placate local religious leaders and honor the gods. The next stop for Alexander was to Persia proper. And in Persia, he got a little naughty, I guess. Well, part of it was legit. He acquired the Persian treasury. Darius had fled so quickly he couldn't take his money with him. And so Alexander came upon 40 talents of gold. And I'm sure you are all very familiar with the Persian to dollar conversion rate. But for those of you who aren't, 40,000 talents of gold is about $4 billion, making Darius probably the richest man on the planet at the time. Excuse me, making Alexander the richest man on the planet. The Persian capital of Persepolis, Alexander did get a bit naughty, as I said. Unlike most of the places he conquered, Alexander actually had the Persian capital burned. Why? Well, in retaliation for the burning of Athens, of course, 150 years earlier. And it probably had great symbolic value too, to burn your enemy's capital. Well, Darius was still on the loose, at least for a little while, until he was murdered by his own followers. And briefly, a little puppet kingdom was set up by remnants of Darius's court, but Alexander was soon able to destroy that. Now, from his soldiers' perspective, they were probably dusting their hands off and saying, "Mission accomplished. We've done this. We set out what we accomplished to do." But Alexander was not done. He hadn't come out just to destroy the Persians. He had come out to conquer the world. And so he pushed his men deep into Central Asia, into a place called Bactria at the time. We would probably call it Afghanistan, Uzbekistan nowadays. This proved to be some of the hardest fighting of Alexander's career. These tribes were notoriously warlike and difficult to conquer. And after 4 years of hard, inglorious fighting, Alexander was finally able to defeat them. The next stop on the Alexander Express was India. Now, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with Asian geography, you'll know that India is kind of like in South Central Asia. It's got China and Thailand and Vietnam on its eastern border. But according to knowledge in the West at that time, India was the end of the world. In other words, could Alexander push through India, he would hit the Pacific Ocean, although they didn't call it the Pacific Ocean, obviously, at that time, and he would be done. He'd be pretty much master of the world. And so he was very excited about this. And in India, Alexander was once again able to defeat some of the kings of Western India. Significantly during these battles, the Macedonians had to fight elephants, which they were horrified of, but they were successful. And so Alexander could almost taste it. He was at the Indus River, according to his map anyways. Indus River is right over here, and it would be just a little push over, and we could get to the Pacific, and he'd be master of the world. Unfortunately for Alexander, his men balked at this. They simply refused to go any further. It had now been 10 years, and they weren't having it. They had heard rumors that elephants were just the beginning. India was a land of all kinds of monsters and strange people and terrible things, and they didn't want to go any further. And so, against his will and very much angrily, Alexander turned around and marched his troops back through Persia and back to Babylon, where he set up shop. Now, Alexander had a brand new set of problems in front of him. He had been absolutely brilliant as a commander, brilliant and successful in almost every operation he had undertaken, but now he had to go from being conqueror to ruler. Now, things started off fairly well because he threw some massive parties celebrating his great victories while back in Mesopotamia. And to celebrate his victories, he took 2 wives. Darius's daughter was one of them. And this was partly to consolidate his new kingdom, his new legitimacy, marry the old king's daughter. He also encouraged his men to take Persian wives, and he dipped into a little of his $4 billion in cash to provide dowries for the women and marriage gifts for the men. And his goal here was to create a brand new ruling class. Alexander, by all accounts, was a fairly enlightened leader. He recognized that there was a lot of hostility between Persian and Greek, and his goal was to break down those barriers. He hoped that the offspring of these Persian and Greek unions would be a new type of ruling class. That these biracial children, if you want to call it that, these bilingual children, they would be bilingual, half Greek and half Persian, would break down these barriers, and this would become the new ruling class of this new glorious order that Alexander hoped to create. Alexander faced a lot of pushback on much of what he was trying to do, mostly from the Macedonians and Greeks. They had been raised in this xenophobic environment. You'll remember xenophobic means fear of foreigners. And they were not about to embrace the Persians, so many of his soldiers disliked a lot of Alexander's policies. They didn't want to embrace this new world order that he was creating. And part of it was the fact that he had begun to adopt Persian court rituals, particularly the practice of prostration. This is when someone basically face plants. It was very common in the Persian court when you talked to the king that you just did this massive face plant called a prostration. This, along with Alexander's adopted divine birth story. His soldiers never really took to the idea that he was the son of Zeus Ammon. They didn't like his new Persian attire. They didn't like his new Persian rituals, and they frankly thought he was going native. And so there was very bitter resentment toward what Alexander was attempting to do. They were particularly horrified by the fact that Alexander was beginning to adopt Persian military techniques and adopt Persians into the Macedonian army. They didn't like that. They also didn't like the fact that Alexander was keeping many Persians in high positions. Alexander had adopted this Persian administrative structure. So the satrapies, as they're called, and a Persian governor was called a satrap. And Alexander decided to leave many of these people in place. Why? Well, these were people who knew what they were doing already. They had already been governor. They already knew how the system worked. And from Alexander's perspective, the idea was, why mess with it? If this guy already knows the job and he's going to be loyal to me, I'll leave a Persian in if he's going to do a better job than a Greek or a Macedonian. Unfortunately for many of his followers who had fought and bled for him, they thought that these positions should go to them and that the Persians should essentially be thrown out of power. And so the last years of Alexander's reign as kings were very fraught. Okay, well, the question is, what were the main issues of contention between Alexander and his Macedonian and Greek followers?